The world knew Ace Frehley as Space Ace, the mysterious silver-faced guitar god of Kiss. The world knew Eddie Van Halen as the King, the revolutionary genius who redefined rock guitar forever. But in the summer of 1980, these two titans collided in a way that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with pride, jealousy, and a woman whose name would be whispered in backstage circles for decades to come. What happened that night in California would create a rift so deep that Eddie Van Halen would spend the next 25 years subtly diminishing Ace Frehley in interviews. Always with that trademark grin, always claiming it was about the music. But those who were there knew the truth. This wasn't about guitars or technique or who played faster. This was personal. This was about betrayal. And this was about a moment that changed how two guitar legends saw each other forever. If you want to discover the untold stories behind rock's greatest rivalries, subscribe to this channel. Because the real drama always happened when the stage lights went dark. The California Music Festival of 1980 was supposed to be a celebration. 3 days of rock royalty descending upon the sun-baked landscape of Southern California, where Van Halen was riding the unstoppable wave of their Women and Children first album, and Kiss was desperately trying to prove they were still relevant in a changing musical landscape. By 1980, the cracks in Kiss were already showing. Ace Frehley was drinking heavily, his performances becoming increasingly unpredictable, and the friction between him and Paul Stanley had reached a point where they barely spoke off stage. But Ace still had that magnetism, that dangerous rock and roll charisma that made people gravitate toward him even as he was falling apart. Eddie Van Halen, on the other hand, was experiencing the opposite trajectory. Van Halen had exploded onto the scene just 2 years earlier with their self-titled debut, and Eddie's revolutionary tapping technique had made him the most talked-about guitarist in the world. He was young, he was confident, and he was engaged to actress Valerie Bertinelli, whose star was rising thanks to the hit television show One Day at a Time. Eddie and Valerie were rock's golden couple, photographed everywhere, their relationship seemingly perfect in that glossy magazine cover way that the early 80s celebrated. The festival organizers had arranged for both bands to share the same backstage compound, a sprawling area of trailers, tents, and makeshift lounges where musicians, crew members, and various hangers-on mixed freely between sets. It was the kind of environment that bred both camaraderie and chaos, where too much alcohol, too much ego, and too much proximity could turn a casual encounter into something explosive. And that's exactly what happened. Ace Frehley arrived at the festival in rough shape. He had been arguing with Gene Simmons about his solo work, frustrated that Kiss management was trying to control his creative output, even as the band's popularity was declining. He felt trapped, suffocated by the Space Ace persona that had once liberated him but now felt like a prison. The makeup, the costume, the expectations, it was all crushing him. And when Ace felt trapped, he did what he always did. He drank. He partied. He looked for distractions that would help him forget the weight of expectations and the knowledge that his relationship with Kiss was dying. But what Ace found that night wasn't just a distraction. It was a lit match in a room full of gasoline. Valerie Bertinelli had accompanied Eddie to the festival, something she didn't always do. She loved Eddie deeply, but the rock and roll lifestyle wasn't always comfortable for her. The drugs, the groupies, the constant chaos backstage. It was a world away from the wholesome image she projected on television. But Eddie had asked her to come, proud to show off his performance at such a prestigious event, eager to have her see him command a stage in front of 50,000 screaming fans. She had agreed, spending most of the afternoon in Van Halen's private trailer, staying away from the heavier party areas where cocaine was being passed around openly and where the atmosphere could turn predatory. Ace Frehley wandered into the communal backstage lounge sometime around 7 in the evening, hours before Kiss was scheduled to perform. He was already drunk, his signature aviator sunglasses perched on his nose even though the sun was setting. His Kiss tour jacket unzipped to reveal a sweat-stained t-shirt underneath. The lounge was crowded with musicians and industry people, everyone networking, everyone trying to be seen with the right people. And there, sitting alone at a corner table with a glass of wine, was Valerie Bertinelli. What happened next depends on who tells the story. Ace's version, shared years later in carefully worded interviews that never mentioned names, was that he struck up a conversation with a beautiful woman who seemed lonely and out of place at a rock festival. He claimed he didn't know who she was, didn't recognize her from television, and certainly didn't know she was Eddie Van Halen's fiancée. It was just friendly conversation, he insisted. The kind of casual backstage interaction that happened 1,000 times at every festival. They talked about music, about California, about nothing particularly meaningful. And yes, he admitted, he might have been flirtatious. That was just his personality. But it was innocent. The witnesses tell a different story. They remember Ace sitting down at Valerie's table uninvited, leaning in close, his arm draped over the back of her chair in a way that was unmistakably territorial. They remember him ordering another round of drinks for both of them, his laugh getting louder, his behavior becoming more animated as Valerie smiled politely, clearly uncomfortable but too gracious to make a scene. They remember Ace touching her arm when he talked, leaning in to whisper something in her ear that made her pull back slightly, her smile becoming more forced. And they remember the exact moment Eddie Van Halen walked into the lounge and saw them together. Eddie had just finished Van Halen's sound check, his guitar still strapped across his chest, his trademark striped instrument gleaming under the backstage lights. He was in that post-performance adrenaline state, energized and looking for Valerie to share his excitement about how good the band sounded. He scanned the crowded room and spotted her immediately, and then he saw Ace Frehley sitting far too close, his body language screaming intimacy, his hand now resting on the table inches from Valerie's. The room didn't go silent. This wasn't a movie. The background noise of conversation and laughter continued. But for those paying attention, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden tension that made people turn their heads to see what was happening. Eddie walked across the room slowly, his jaw set, his eyes locked on Ace. Valerie saw him coming, and her face immediately showed relief mixed with apprehension. She knew that look. She knew Eddie's temper when he felt disrespected. Eddie didn't explode. That wasn't his style. Instead, he walked up to the table, put his hand firmly on Valerie's shoulder in a possessive gesture that made his relationship to her unmistakable, and looked directly at Ace Frehley. The two guitarists locked eyes, and for a moment, the air crackled with unspoken challenge. Eddie didn't have to say anything about Valerie. Instead, he aimed for where he knew it would hurt most. He went after Ace's playing. "Ace," Eddie said, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I caught some of your set last time Kiss came through. Interesting guitar work. Very theatrical. I guess that's what people want from Kiss, right? The show, the costumes, the smoke and mirrors." It was a surgical strike. Eddie had just dismissed Ace's musicianship as secondary to spectacle, had reduced Space Ace to nothing more than a prop in a theatrical production. And he had done it in front of Valerie, in front of industry people, in front of anyone within earshot. The insult was clear to everyone who understood the language of rock and roll ego. Eddie wasn't saying Ace was bad. He was saying Ace wasn't a real guitarist. He was saying Ace was an actor playing dress-up while real musicians like Eddie Van Halen were revolutionizing the instrument. Ace Frehley went pale beneath his sunglasses. The alcohol in his system made his reaction slower than it might have been, but the fury was building visibly. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was taller than Eddie, broader, and for a moment it looked like the confrontation might turn physical. Security personnel positioned around the room shifted their weight, ready to intervene. But Ace didn't throw a punch. Instead, he did something arguably worse. He laughed. "That's funny coming from a guy who built his whole career on one gimmick," Ace said, his words slightly slurred but still sharp enough to cut. "Tapping. Wow. Real revolutionary, Eddie. You play fast. Congratulations. But speed isn't soul. And from where I'm standing, you're just a kid showing off in his bedroom, hoping someone notices." The gauntlet had been thrown, and everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed the beginning of a feud that would simmer for decades. Eddie Van Halen's face flushed red. His hand tightened on Valerie's shoulder until she winced slightly and touched his wrist, silently asking him to let go. Eddie released her, but didn't break eye contact with Ace. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, but somehow more threatening because of it. "Stay away from my fiancé," Eddie said simply. "And maybe spend less time drinking and more time practicing. Your solos are getting sloppy. Everyone in the business is talking about it." Ace took a step closer, and now they were only a foot apart. Two of rock's biggest guitar heroes facing off like gunfighters in the Old West. The room had definitely gone quieter now, conversations dying as everyone's attention focused on the confrontation. Valerie stood up, trying to physically place herself between them, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Eddie, let's just go," she said quietly. "Please, this isn't worth it." But Ace wasn't done. The alcohol, the frustration with Kiss, the humiliation of being called out in public, it all boiled over. He pointed a finger at Eddie's chest, stopping just short of actually touching him. "You think you're the king of guitar because you can play fast?" Ace's voice rose. "I was playing arenas when you were still in high school, kid. Kiss created the blueprint for rock spectacle that everyone copied, including you. So don't come at me with your technical superiority bullshit. Music is about emotion. It's about connecting with people. And all your speed means nothing if there's no heart behind it." Eddie smiled then, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who had already won the argument and was just waiting for his opponent to realize it. "Then why is your band falling apart, Ace? Why are you here drunk at 7 p.m. while I just finished a sound check stone cold sober? Why are the rumors saying Kiss is about to lose their lead guitarist because he can't get his act together?" That was the line that crossed from professional rivalry into personal destruction. Because Eddie had just said out loud what everyone in the industry knew but hadn't yet gone public. Ace Frehley was on his way out of Kiss. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background music from the festival stage seemed to fade away. Ace's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, pain, and finally a kind of defeated resignation. He looked at Eddie, then at Valerie, then back at Eddie. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only those closest could hear. "You're going to regret this," Ace said. "Maybe not today. Maybe not next year. But someday, you're going to look back and realize that you didn't need to do this. We could have been friends. We could have respected each other. But you chose this. Ace turned and walked out of the lounge, his gait unsteady, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look suddenly older and more vulnerable than the rock god image he projected on stage. Eddie watched him go, his arm now wrapped protectively around Valerie, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been guilt. Valerie looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. We were just talking." Eddie's jaw clenched. He was all over you, and he knew exactly who you were. That wasn't innocent conversation. That was him trying to prove he could take whatever he wanted, including my girl. Whether that was true or whether Eddie had overreacted to a harmless flirtation became a matter of debate in the years that followed. But the damage was done. The story of the confrontation spread through the Backstage area within minutes, growing and mutating with each retelling. By the time Kiss took the stage 3 hours later, everyone in the festival knew that Ace Frehley and Eddie Van Halen had nearly come to blows over Valerie Bertinelli. And Ace's performance that night was a disaster. He missed cues, played wrong notes, and at one point appeared to forget what song they were performing, standing motionless on stage for several bars, while Paul Stanley shot him increasingly frantic looks. The Kiss performance, which should have been a triumphant showcase, instead became evidence of exactly what Eddie had accused Ace of, being unable to get his act together. The reviews the next day were brutal, and when journalists asked Eddie Van Halen about Kiss's set, he simply smiled that same cold smile and said, "I think they're going through some internal issues. It's tough when a band loses its focus." The festival ended. The bands went their separate ways, but the animosity remained. In interviews over the following years, Eddie Van Halen developed a pattern. Whenever Ace Frehley's name came up, Eddie would acknowledge his influence with the faintest hint of condescension. "Ace was important for what he did in Kiss," he would say. "The whole space character thing was very visual, very theatrical." The words were technically complimentary, but the tone carried a clear subtext. Ace was a showman, not a serious musician. Not like Eddie. Ace, for his part, rarely mentioned Eddie by name, but when pressed, he would talk about guitarists who confused technical proficiency with musical soul, who thought playing fast was the same as playing with feeling. "Some guys are all about the notes," he said in a 1985 interview shortly after leaving Kiss. "They can play 1,000 notes a minute, and every one of them is technically perfect, and every one of them is emotionally empty. That's not the kind of guitarist I ever wanted to be." The industry insiders who knew about the California Festival incident understood these weren't abstract philosophical statements. These were two wounded egos taking shots at each other through the press, continuing a feud that had started over a woman and evolved into something deeper about artistic legitimacy and rock and roll credibility. But here's what neither of them ever publicly acknowledged. They were more alike than different. Both Ace Frehley and Eddie Van Halen were innovators who transformed how their generation approached the electric guitar. Both struggled with the pressures of fame and turned to substances to cope. Both eventually found themselves in bands that constrained them creatively, leading to bitter departures and solo careers that never quite captured the magic of their early work. Both married and divorced, struggled with sobriety, and spent their later years trying to secure their legacies in a music industry that had moved on to new heroes. They were two sides of the same coin, tragic figures whose genius was always accompanied by self-destructive tendencies. In 2006, something unexpected happened. Both Ace and Eddie found themselves at the same industry event, the first time they had been in the same room since that night in 1980. 26 years had passed. Eddie was divorced from Valerie, sober, and battling cancer. Ace was also sober, having survived his own near-death experiences with alcoholism and reckless living. They were both older, weathered by life, facing their mortality in ways they couldn't have imagined as young rock gods. According to witnesses, they saw each other across the room. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Eddie walked over, his hand extended. Ace looked at the hand, then at Eddie's face, searching for some sign of mockery or continued animosity. But Eddie's expression was open, tired, genuinely conciliatory. Ace took his hand. They shook. And then, to everyone's surprise, they hugged briefly, awkwardly, the way men do when they're trying to convey something their words can't quite express. "We were young and stupid," Eddie said simply. "Yeah," Ace replied. "We were." They talked for about 10 minutes, comparing notes on sobriety, on health scares, on the strange experience of watching their music be rediscovered by new generations who had no idea about the backstage dramas and personal feuds. It wasn't a profound conversation. It wasn't a tearful reconciliation. But it was closure of a sort, an acknowledgement that the resentment they had carried for a quarter century was heavy and exhausting and ultimately pointless. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020, at the age of 65. When the news broke, Ace Frehley posted a simple tribute on social media. Eddie was one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. The world lost a true innovator today. Rest in peace. No mention of their conflict. No reference to that night in California. Just a straightforward acknowledgement of Eddie's genius from someone who understood better than most what it meant to be a guitar hero. In interviews after Eddie's death, Ace was asked about their relationship. He was more candid than he had been in decades, admitting they had differences over the years, but emphasizing Eddie's importance to rock music. "We came from different places musically," Ace said, "but we both loved the guitar, and we both wanted to push it further than anyone thought possible. That's a bond that matters more than any personal disagreements." The story of that 1980 confrontation remains largely untold in official band histories. It doesn't appear in the authorized biographies or the documentary films. Valerie Bertinelli, in her own memoir, mentioned attending some rock festivals with Eddie, but never specifically referenced the Ace Frehley incident. Perhaps she doesn't remember it as particularly significant, just another night in a world full of male posturing and testosterone-fueled drama. Or perhaps she chose not to memorialize a moment that showed the darker, more possessive side of a man she once loved. But for those who were there, who witnessed two legends clash over pride and jealousy and perceived disrespect, the memory remains vivid. Because it captured something essential about the rock and roll ego, about the way fame and insecurity intertwine, about how even the most talented artists can be reduced to their most petty instincts when they feel threatened. Space Ace and the King. Two guitar legends. One woman. One night that changed how they saw each other forever. The betrayal Eddie Van Halen never forgave wasn't really about Valerie Bertinelli. It was about respect. It was about Ace Frehley failing to acknowledge the invisible boundaries that existed between musicians. The unspoken code that said you don't move in on another man's territory. Whether that territory is his woman or his reputation or his position in the rock hierarchy. And Eddie's response, his public humiliation of Ace, was about asserting dominance in the only language both men truly understood: the language of the guitar. In the end, their feud became just another footnote in rock history, a minor drama in the grand tapestry of music legends who fought and feuded and occasionally made peace before time ran out. But for those who understand the psychology of creative genius, who recognize that art and ego are inseparable, the story of Ace Frehley and Eddie Van Halen matters. It reminds us that beneath the legendary performances and the iconic riffs and the stadium-shaking solos, these were just human beings, flawed, insecure, capable of petty jealousy and grudges that lasted decades. And maybe that's what makes their music even more powerful. Because it came from real people who felt real pain and real anger and real competition. Every note they played was informed by experiences like that night in California, when two of rock's greatest guitarists stood face to face and couldn't see past their own egos to recognize the genius in each other. The world remembers Eddie Van Halen as the king, the revolutionary who redefined what was possible on 6 strings. The world remembers Ace Frehley as Space Ace, the mysterious guitar god whose image defined an era of rock spectacle. But on one summer night in 1980, they were just 2 men fighting over pride. And the scars from that fight never completely healed, even after they shook hands 26 years later. Even after one of them died and the other was left to remember what might have been if they had chosen friendship over rivalry. That's the real legacy of their conflict. Not who was the better guitarist, not who was right about the confrontation, but the reminder that talent doesn't make you immune to pettiness, and success doesn't make you wise. Sometimes the greatest artists are the most damaged people, and sometimes the feuds that seem most trivial are the ones that cut the deepest. Because in rock and roll, as in life, it's never really about the music. It's about the ego behind the music. And that ego never forgets. It never forgives. It just plays on.